episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you, Chris?
I'm doing just fine and dandy, Jody. How are you?
I'm doing all right. In fact, I'll add the word ducky to that. Fine, dandy, and ducky.
Damn, I can't even top that. That's amazing. I'm very happy for you.
Woohoo!
That's
I got
great.
one up again.
Yay.
Yay.
I can actually let a little bit of news out for me. That's fun.
What? Oh, do tell.
I hinted at a few episodes ago that I was working on this artist, this British artist, is named David Haynes. And,
does he drink tea?
I'm sure he does. Yeah, he's really, really good guitar player, very much steeped in like the old school English kind of classic rock type of thing. But his album was dropped off to me today that I mixed for him.
Dropped off as in like you now have like a CD of it, or like you had to download it?
No, physical actual CD.
Was this the USPS that delivered this?
This was Mr. Haynes himself that drove this past.
Oh, so he lives in LA and he's getting out away from the shelter-in-place command.
He was wearing a mask and plastic gloves in his car. So
good for him. Well done, you.
But that was kind of cool. So I got that and listened to it. I didn't master it, obviously. I mixed it, but listen to it and see what it sounds like. So,
and we can find this on like Spotify and iTunes and all that fun stuff?
It should be. Yeah, I think the official release date he set was May 1st. So by the time this airs, yes, it will be definitely out. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So there was that. But I guess we'll just dive into the episode, shall we?
Yeah, we should just go head first right into it. This today is part 2 of mixing lead vocals, and we're going to discuss some slightly different characteristics. And if you're watching the video, you just about got poked in the eye.
Yeah. Don't poke people in the eye. Today we're dealing with part 2 of mixing lead vocals. And last episode, we talked about having and consolidating our lead vocal onto one track. And we went into fairly in depth with how we like to approach compression ratios and how much we do that. So we're not going to go into as much this time. We're going to talk about a different technique. But if you're interested in that, go back and listen to that
part
episode. Part 1 of this.
The one prior to this one.
Yeah. So since it's part 2,
yes,
we're dealing with lead vocals on more than one track.
That's right. I think, because 2 is more than 1.
More is more, isn't it?
More is more. That is correct. The infamous drummer from Rush, Mr. Neil Peart, once said, "Less is less, more is more."
There you go.
Truer words were never spoken.
Right.
And less is not necessarily more. Less is just less. More is more.
Less is always less. It doesn't necessarily mean better, but less is always less and more is always more.
Right. And that more doesn't mean better either. So,
but it's
the whole concept of less is more. Meh.
Yeah.
Let's bury that now. Meh.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. And just like Yngwie said, how can less be more? More is more.
That's correct. Silly Swedes.
So why would you have your lead vocal on more than one track, Jody?
Why would I do it? It's an organizational thing for me.
Mm-hmm.
I very much like to organize verses to verses. If there's pre-choruses, pre-choruses to pre-choruses, choruses to choruses, bridges to bridges, B parts to B parts, A parts to A parts, C parts to C parts, whatever you call them.
Right.
I like to kind of group things in that nature. Now, that being said, there are some times when I mix on the single lead vocal on a single channel thing, but quite often, quite often, probably 90% plus, I am doing multiple lead vocal tracks.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's just for you to have more control over
each individual section.
Song
that is
for
correct.
Processing. Yeah.
That is correct.
Yeah.
I have become this weird, like, nutcase over making sure that lead vocals become their own entity for every section of a song. And
tell us more.
No, I will not. That's it. Done. Episode's over. we're done.
Yep.
5 minutes. It's done. No.
That's the way you're going to react, man.
All right. I'm through. I can't do this anymore. No, essentially what I mean by that is that I really like each vocal to have its own dynamic space. And it's much easier to apply that using lead vocal for verses on a track, lead vocals for a pre-chorus on a track, lead vocals for choruses on a track, and so on. Does that make sense?
Yes,
It becomes a lot less cumbersome from the automation standpoint to deal with individual part lead tracks for me, considering the sheer amount of nuttiness that I throw at vocals.
Right. And there, I think that's a very important point there, because the stuff that you tend to do, now I'm talking about your music now, not stuff that you do for other people, where you still might approach it the same way, but you tend to do music that's generally sort of like in the pop genre.
To an extent, yes.
To an extent. Well,
to a good extent.
Painting with very broad strokes here.
Oops, very broad.
Hello.
And the guitar decided to speak at that.
So the lead vocal is most certainly king up front. And you...
Well, yeah, I'm not Yngwie Malmsteen, damn it.
Right. But in the music that you make, you tend to have a lot more things happen to the vocal in different sections of the song as well.
Bingo.
So the processing there might be different. You might have a completely different reverb, or maybe even some modulation things going on in a verse, for example. And you know, you may also have, we touched on this briefly in last episode, but you might have a completely different proximity effect in the vocal. Yep. So if you apply the same kind of EQ for that as you would in a verse or in a chorus part or pre-chorus part, it might not be suitable. So you end up, instead of having to automate EQ curves, you just have a completely different track and treat them accordingly. So in this case...
And I need a sound effect right now that shows me shaking my head up and down, yes.
Yeah, the head bobber. Yeah. Where we talked last episode about keeping a mix simple by having everything on one track and manageable.
Well, we didn't really say the KISS method of keep it simple, stupid.
No, but keeping, I think we used the phrase manageable.
Manageable, yes, definitely manageable.
But in this case, you having more tracks actually makes it more manageable because of the way that you're ending up treating them.
That is correct.
Right.
I find it much more manageable because of the way things happen from part to part. I like to treat parts as their own entities within a building, a foundation, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So now also we're not talking about necessarily vocal parts where it might be some like producer candy, where it might be a throw somewhere, a vocal throw. We're talking about the actual lead vocal, in different part of the song.
Yeah, yeah.
So so what are some things that you might do differently to vocals in between different parts?
Things I might do differently. Well, let's take an example of a song that I was throwing a mix from Logic and recreating it in Luna yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
I have different lead vocal lines for each part, for the verse, for the pre-chorus, for the chorus, and for the bridge. And each one of those gets a different set of effects because of the way the song is structured. So my verse vocal in that particular song is actually a fair amount drier than the chorus vocal, because the chorus is so ginormous. And oddly enough, the title kind of lends itself to that.
Okay.
Because it's called Supernova.
Self-promo alert.
Yep. No. I don't even want to say the title anymore. Done. But the verse has an entirely different effect because it's a little bit more intimate. That's the way I came across with the mix on it. So the reverbs and the delays that I use and the effects that I use on the verse vocal are entirely different from the verse and chorus and the pre-chorus vocals. So on that particular verse, I'm using a very short slap on the verse vocal, coupled with yet another reverb that is a very light tail that doesn't tail off for a very long time, just to give some additional space in the rhythmic sense. Then it uses a stereo delay as well. That is a short stereo delay. In the chorus, I use a different slap that has a slightly different pre-delay to it, so it gets a different rhythmic value. Then I combine it with a slightly longer, more airy fairy dust, as you would say, reverb tail.
Yeah.
And then from there, I use a different stereo delay along with a very long delay.
Okay.
That tucks in underneath.
So you're building this as
the
song is advancing.
Yes. And then, of course, when it comes off the chorus and goes back to the next verse, it takes all of that back to what the first verse has. So it brings it back down. So it builds over time, section for section. And that becomes easier when I'm using separate lead tracks per part. If I were to do all of that on the same lead vocal from beginning to end in the song, I'd have probably 14 sends going on and a plethora of automation things to worry about. Whereas when I have it on each individual track, I do the sends. I don't have to automate those sends, and I don't have to worry about turning them on and off in various values. I can just do the track, the sends, and bust them and be done with it. Much easier in that regard.
Yeah. So it does get, even though you're dealing with more tracks, it does get cleaner, and in the sense of automation and mixing and all this kind of stuff. You're doing the heavy lifting by separating the tracks, essentially.
Correcto.
Yeah.
Correcto.
And
so in that regard, I get a lot more control over the individual effects that are happening per section.
Sure. Yeah. Not to spend a whole lot of time on it because we went relatively in depth last episode, but in the case that you're describing now, how different will, in a general sense, your EQ and compression settings be on each vocal? Do you find yourself having a certain starting point, or finding like, no, I need to treat this drastically different, or how does that usually lend itself to your workflow?
Here comes that phrase again. Program dependent. Take a shot.
We made it to 14 minutes this time.
About that, yeah. So it is program dependent. Fortunately, if I'm the one doing the tracking before the mixing, generally speaking, the EQ values are not super drastic from part to part. So it becomes easier to deal with. And in that regard, most of the time, unless it's something that needs to be a substantial artistic, creative function of the EQ from section to section is actually the same EQ settings generally, with one minor difference.
And what be that?
That generally, at this point in time in my mixing career, the Moog EQ, the EQ4, with its lovely airband, that airband will actually be adjusted from part to part.
What a very Jody thing to do.
Right? Very Jody thing to do. So I will do my general EQing for what the vocal might needs, whether it might be with an API channel strip or whatever EQ that I tend to think of at the time of the song, of like, this will be the right EQ for everything. I then will do the Moog EQ after it, and the only EQ part that I tend to use most often, sometimes I'll use other parts of it, but most often it's the airband on the Mod
Right.
EQ.
Yeah.
And say that if I have it set to 20K on the verse with a 2 dB boost, on the pre-chorus, it might go to 2.5 or 3 dB. On the chorus, it might go to 3 to 3.5 dB. So I'll bring the air band up to kind of bring the excitement level of the air in the EQ section from part to part.
Yeah.
And that would be the minute difference between sections on the EQing.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's
yeah.
something that we've talked about a little bit in prior episodes here as well. But a phrase that you and I like to use when we talk privately here as well is that might not seem like much, but it's all of those little differences compounded over
Yes.
a mix
That add up.
They add up. It's like it's 1% there and it's 1% there, and all of a sudden it's like these slight changes that can have a bigger impact on your mix than you might think.
Very much so.
Yeah.
It's just that little hint of extra excitement in the EQ that just makes it stand out.
I'll have to try that. I've never done that with the air band, that kind of thing. So I'll have to try that and see when that might be inappropriate.
Yeah, I mean, it's not
vocal or
100%
anything.
of the time, but generally when that happens,
Yeah.
that's what I'm doing. That's the differences in the EQ. Now, mind you, if it's something that deals more with a proximity problem, well, that's a whole different ballgame.
Right.
And I'm going to attempt to fix all of that before I get to the mix prep stage. Like, I will hopefully get most of the vocals within the same EQable range when I go to bounce everything out for the mix template that I use.
Right before you're starting to
before I'm even getting there.
Yeah.
So, but we're talking about the actual mix process. So we've already made the assumption that has happened, that the mix prep was done correctly, and I don't have to do drastically weird EQ things while I'm actually mixing.
Right. Yeah.
So.
And this is a process that you would go through, even though, let's say it's a project that you get that you're just going to mix.
Yeah.
So that you get all the tracks, you go through, or here's a potential problem, blah, blah, blah. You go through and fix that as best as you can. Then a whole new session, go in and start the actual mixing. Yeah.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Yes.
We talked about that as well, but again, it's like nothing kills the workflow more when you're sitting and you're trying to be creative with a mix and try to move fast to keep that sort of freshness and objective view of the mix. And then you go, oh man, I got to tune this vocal, or I got to get rid of that squeaky kick drum, or whatever it happens to be. And it's like, oh, grinding to a halt. So yeah.
Grind.
So,
slave to the grind.
So EQ and compression are relatively similar. Now, you talked about having a different slap, a different sort of like pre-delays, that kind of thing, to create just something different. What are other things that you may do? Because we have some extreme things that we've kind of done when we've collaborated on stuff as well, where we've used some hardcore kind of vocal processing to kind of blend in there too.
Do tell. Remind me, please.
Well, this was vocal synth, was it?
Vocal synth?
Yeah, from the good people of
that's
Isotope.
A fun one from Mr. Isotope Company.
Yes.
I don't know. It's not the real great. Isotope is the company.
Right. Where we've had that and had some where just sounds like this demonic voice coming at you, right? But having something like that, to it doesn't have to be used that extremely, but that's one case that I'm thinking about where you've outputted one of those for me to mix, and then we're just blending that in.
Yep.
Yeah, even though it's not necessarily up front in the mix, but it's tucked there, and it's one of those like little production candy type of things that you might, third time you listen to the piece when you get your headphones on, it's like, oh, what the hell is that? That sounds kind of cool, but it does add another dimension,
That reminds me, somebody once made a comment about one of my songs, like, what the hell was that? Flying cars?
That was a rough sample to capture, right?
Right. Essentially, it's the concept of like, why does this rock song have all of this pop flavored candy going on in it? It's like, well, to make people say, what the fuck is that? Flying cars?
Yeah, yeah. Things that might not be obvious at the first time you're listening to it, but
Yeah.
yeah, those are cool things. So what else do you tend to do when you're using this sort of like so how much of this is going to be parallel processing, Jody?
Almost 100% of it, really. On the individual tracks themselves, it's going to be the compressor or the limiter and then the EQ. And when I say limiter, I'm referring to things like the 1176, because that to me almost denotes limitation more than compression, even though I'd probably considered a compressor. But its gate is so fast in a sense of when it clamps down on things that it becomes more like a limiter to me. So depending on the vibe that I want coming out of it, the kind of crunch or the kind of flow or the feel, I'm going to choose the compressor that goes to that. And generally I'm going to use the same compressor or limiter on each section. I might tweak the amount that it's hitting each vocal line from section to section, but it's not going to be drastic. It's just like the EQ. It's just one little bit that might change from here to there.
And that might come down to a performance thing as well, right?
It does.
Where you might, if you're projecting more, you might have to hit it a little harder or just back off on automation or something like that.
Yeah. So but that's a performance
besides
thing.
that, so what about spatial effects and that kind of thing? That's all going on sends, I'm guessing, right?
Yeah, everything that is not like the compressor and the EQ is going to ascend.
Yeah.
100%. Very rarely would I ever throw the reverb on the vocal or the delay on the vocal, on the channel strip of the vocal that I'm dealing with, unless it's a background thing. But that's not we're not talking about backgrounds today. We're talking about leads. Yeah. So leads will it's probably 99.9999 to infinity% that I will put the actual effect on the channel strip. It's always going to be a bus. Literally always. And it's sending to a bus. So in that regard, it will be parallel and then coming back.
Now, how about the return on those buses? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking that now you have, let's say, 3 lead lines. You got a verse, a pre-chorus, and a vocal. Those are then in turn outputting to a master vocal bus?
No, I separate my lead vocal lines to a bus and my background vocal lines to a bus. Yeah, but so there's 2 buses before they hit the overall vocal bus.
Right, but we're talking about, okay, so you're sending all these 3 lead lines to a lead vocal bus, but what happens to
the effects?
The effects returns. Do they go to the same bus, or do you have a separate? They go to the lead vocal bus and then on through to the master vocal bus.
That's correct. So when I have effects that are affecting the lead vocal bus or the lead vocal, they will also feed to that lead vocal bus. Right. So that I can hit mute and all the lead vocals, including the effects that go with them, gone.
Yeah.
And then when we get to a background vocal episode, same story there. All background vocals go to a background vocal bus. All their effects go to the background vocal bus. Boom, done. And then the lead vocal bus and the background vocal bus then feed to a master vocal bus for all the vocals.
Right. And the reason you're doing this is something that we both learned through workflow there. And I think we talked about this a little bit when we talked about workflow in mixing. But if you're in a situation where you're outputting different versions of a mix, or you're an instrumental version or whatever type of version, it makes that process a lot easier. So it's just...
Si, senor.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that, from experience, you've kind of learned to do that just to kind of hedge your bets and knowing...
it makes it a hell of a lot easier on the outputting of various versions of songs.
There you go. I couldn't have said it more eloquent than that.
Well, you were trying. I was
trying. You got to give me an E for effort there. Again, I'm not from your country. That's my main excuse for everything.
And English is your second language.
Yes, this is true. Damn it, Jody, you ruined my my
Your
cop
flow?
out.
Damn.
Yeah, no, but just my cop out.
Okay.
No, but that's something that just through our experience, and we've sort of arrived at similar conclusions there. With the more control that you have at that stage, and that's why we're using these multiple buses. It's not just that we're championing for the world champion in audio busing, right? Because I think that would always be Michael Brower probably, but
no, that guy wins the award for every busing thing possible.
yeah, he's not even in the running anymore, so they just named after him now, right?
It's kind of like Usain Bolt.
Yeah, it's like, okay, you're done. You can't do this anymore. You just, no, but in all seriousness, so then after that, well, then that's it essentially for having your vocals on separate tracks, and that's the main benefit. Now, one thing that we didn't mention today, but we did mention in the prior episode, is another good reason for having your lead vocal on a separate track. It's not necessarily always for processing, but it is if you have overlapping lines. Like, so let's say that you're coming out of a chorus, or there's a call and response type of line, that type of thing. You're pretty much forced to do that.
Yeah, you have to use multiple lines for that. Otherwise,
yeah.
you get something cut off and it sounds funky.
It does sound funky. Anything else that you'd like to cover with that? I think we covered. There's a lot of benefits of doing it this way, unless you're dealing with, well, there really isn't any unless. I was to say, if you have a track that has, or a project that has up towards 100 different tracks going at the same time, and it can be hard to manage. Consolidate as much as you can, but you got to have a little bit of foresight as well. So there might be better option of massaging that track count down to a more manageable level. Why? It could be guitar parts, it could be keyboard parts.
But we're not talking about guitars. We're talking about lead vocals.
That's right. So the point I wanted to make was that the first call of action might not be to cut down and consolidate the vocal tracks.
Right.
If you're planning to do the kind of production that we're talking about today.
The crazy stuff. The stuff that makes me go, what the fuck was that?
Yeah. And, but obviously, again, style dependent here, but once you start adding these little small differences again, right? It could be, like you mentioned, like you have a different pre-delay on your slap going into the pre-chorus. Mm-hmm. Probably not super noticeable to most people right off the bat. But again, it's that little percentage that keeps accruing over the time you mix, and you end up with a cooler result, really.
Well, a result that might make people sit there and go, I wonder what? Okay. They may not know what they've just heard, but they heard it, and it makes them do the RCA Victor dog. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. And even if people don't notice, you know that you did it, and that's kind of like the bottom line as well, right?
That's the winning gold medal right there.
Yeah. No, but I mean, we can laugh about it and sort of half jokingly, but I think it's taking that sort of professional pride, right? In even if you're doing little changes that nobody might ever pick up on, you know that you did it, and you took the time to care to do it a certain way because you care about the end result. So, and it's tremendous fun too, isn't it?
Right?
Yeah.
That's the fun part, when you can throw something into a mix that people may or may not notice.
But you know.
And then somebody else comes along and says, wait a minute. What was that?
What is that? Yeah. So, yeah. So lead vocals on multiple tracks.
Yes, sir.
Could be the order of the day.
Well, it is the order of the day, and it's my favorite way, generally speaking, to work.
Yeah. Maybe you should do a 2-minute Tuesday tip on how you might treat vocals differently on that, just as a quick example to show the people.
I think that's a wise idea. There's our 2-minute Tuesday tip. right
Yep.
there. How
There we
you
go.
can split vocals apart and what you would do different between sections.
There you go.
Yeah,
There you
baby.
go. All right. Is that going to do it, Jody?
I think that'll
Anything that
do
you'd
it.
like to add? I think that will be good enough for.
Just to remind people, we did go way more in depth with dealing about compression and EQ and reverbs and delays and all of that fun, good stuff. That was dealt heavily in last week's episode, part 1 of the lead vocal mixing podcast of Inside the Recording Studio.
Yeah. So
go back and listen if you need more.
Yeah, if you haven't, a little bit more meat on the bone there. But there we go.
And what a bone it is.
Absolutely.
And with that, I'll say, see you later, Chris.
See you, Jody. Thanks for listening and watching if you are, and have an awesome rest of the day, huh?